Wish by Barbara O'Connor, Chapter 14. Wishbone didn't like the collar one bit. He bucked like a bronco when I put it on him, flinging his head like this way and that. Then he sat down and dug his feet in like a mule when I pulled on the rope to get him out of the trap. But after leaving a trail of baloney like Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs, I managed to get him to follow me step by step to the house. Once we were inside, Bertha locked the screen door and I untied the rope. Then we sat on the sofa and watched him. He sniffed everything that was worth sniffing in that house: the shaggy green rug by the front door, Gus's easy chair, Bertha's basket of yarn. Then he made his way cautiously through the rest of the house, inspecting the coat rack by the back door, licking crumbs off the linoleum floor by under the kitchen table. When he spied one of the cats up on the windowsill, he let out a bark. The cat arched his back and hissed. I was relieved when Wishbone just walked away. Bertha had been worried that he was going to chase the cats, and I have to admit I had worried about that a little too. After a while, he got tired of sniffing and lay down next to the sofa and went to sleep. I tiptoed over and sat beside him, stroking his fur and whispering his name. I could hardly believe I had my very own dog. When Gus got home that night, he seemed pleased as punch to see Wishbone sitting there in the kitchen while Bertha cooked chicken fried steak and black-eyed peas. "Well, don't that beat all?" he said. I couldn't keep my hands off Wishbone. I petted his head and stroked his ears and scratched his belly. "Isn't he something?" I said. Gus nodded. "He sure is." "He smells like something, too," Bertha said, making a face. "You're going to have to give him a good bath in the yard tomorrow." "I will." Tomorrow was Saturday, and so I had all day to spend with him. I'd bathe him and walk him. Maybe I'd teach him a trick, like to sit or lay down. I might even take him to Howard's house if I decided not to be mad at him anymore for calling me a quitter and a baby. And then I remember calling him a squirrel-eating hillbilly, with Mrs. Odom standing right there on the porch. My stomach squeezed and my face burned just thinking about that. I knew Howard wouldn't be mad, 'cause that was his way. But I bet Miss Odom hated me now. I bet she wouldn't want me in her house, messing up their goodness with my hateful words. That night I took Wishbone out on the porch with us. Every now and then he perked up his ears at the sounds of a rabbit or something rustling down in the woods. But eventually he laid down and rested his chin right on top of my foot. He didn't even pay any mind to the cat strolling around him. "I think you got yourself a good one, Charlie," Gus said. I smiled down at Wishbone. "I bet he'll be as good as Skeeter," I said. Gus nodded. "I bet he will." "You know what I like best about dogs?" Bertha said. Gus and I waited. "They love you no matter what," Bertha said. She smiled down at Wishbone. "Shoot! I know folks who are cranky and stuck up or bold-faced liars, and their dogs love 'em like they're saints or something. Know what I mean?" Gus nodded and said, "Yep." "I hate to admit it," Bertha went on, "but I bet these cats of mine would run off and never look back if somebody came along with a can of sardines." I leaned down and ran my hand down Wishbone's side. His fur was soft and warm, and he snored real soft while he slept. Then I gazed up at the starry sky and had a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. Thankful. I felt thankful that I had my very own dog who would love me no matter what. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was look for Wishbone to make sure I hadn't just dreamed he was mine. Sure enough, there he was, curled up on the floor beside me. I'd put one of my pillows there for him, and he hadn't wasted 1 minute flopping down on it. I spent the morning bathing him and combing him and picking burrs out of his tail and ticks off his ears. I knew he didn't like it much, but he let me do it. When I was done, he looked so handsome and smelled so good that Bertha kept making a fuss over him and running back into the house to get him another chicken liver. He was so skinny you could count his ribs right through his fur. We need to fatten him up, Bertha said. After lunch, I practiced walking him with the rope tied to his collar. At first, he made it clear he didn't like it. He'd jerk his head this way and that, or sit down and refuse to budge. But I kept a plastic bag full of tiny pieces of cheese and bacon and stuff to lure him along, and after a while, he was trotting right beside me, around the yard, through the garden, up the driveway, and back. I let him take a nap tied up in the shade of the big oak tree on the steep slope by the back door. Bertha brought a tablecloth outside and spread it on the ground next to him. Then the two of us had pimento cheese sandwiches and sweet tea for lunch. Bertha told me a story about some old man named Cooter who used to be the mayor of Colby. He carried a gun, she said, and if anybody parked in front of town hall where they weren't supposed to, he'd shoot their tires out. Really? Really? And his wife used to wash her underpants and hang them on the antenna of her car and then drive around town till they were dry. I wrinkled my nose and said, Ew! Bertha laughed. I know! That big old underwear looked like the national flag of the land of big behinds flapping in the breeze like that. Me and Bertha had a good laugh over that. Every now and then Wishbone's feet jerked and he let out a little yip while he slept. I wondered if he was dreaming about running free again without a rope tied to him. I hoped not. I took a gulp of sweet tea and watched the honeybees flitting over the clover beside us. Clover! Maybe I could find a four-leaf clover. So while Bertha told me about how Cooter and his wife bought a gold mine in Nevada and moved away, I searched and searched. Sure enough, I found one, but I didn't pick it. If you pick it, it will bring you good luck. But if you leave it growing there, you can make a wish, which is exactly what I did. After lunch, I decided I wasn't mad at Howard anymore, so I tied Wishbone's rope leash to the handlebars of Lenny's bike and pedaled down the road to the Odoms. Wishbone seemed to love that, racing along beside me with his ears flapping and his tongue hanging out. When I got to Howard's, he and Dwight and Cotton were in the front yard playing some games that involved throwing tin cans and punching each other. Hey, y'all, I called. Look what I got. They raced over and gathered around Wishbone, stroking his back and patting his head. Wow, Charlie, Howard said, you did it. I couldn't stop myself from beaming at him. I know, I said, isn't it great? Isn't he great? Howard scratched behind Wishbone's ears. Looks like he's got some beagle in him, he said. I like his ears. While the Odom boys made a fuss over him, Wishbone sat there with his eyes closed and a doggy smile on his face. We played with him the whole afternoon. Cotton kept tossing popcorn for him to catch, and Dwight led him across the yard on the leash and got him to jump up into an old cooler and sit. Howard even taught him to shake hands in no time flat. He's smart, Howard said, and we all nodded in agreement. Let's show Mama his tricks, Howard said, hurrying to the porch in his up-down way. With everybody making such a fuss over Wishbone, I'd forgotten what I'd said yesterday when my scrappy temper had grabbed hold of me. But when Mrs. Odom came out to the yard to see Wishbone, I remembered. My face burned and I couldn't even look at her. Howard showed her how Wishbone could sit on the cooler and shake hands. Ain't he smart? He said. He is smart for sure, Mrs. Odom said, and lucky he's found such a fine friend as Charlie. I felt relief wash over me. Maybe Mrs. Odom wasn't mad at me after all. Let's get some treats and teach him to roll over, Howard said. That's a good idea. Mrs. Odom ruffled my hair. I've got some squirrel pie fresh out of the oven. I wanted to sink right into the ground when she said that, or disappear into thin air. Poof! Gone. But of course I couldn't. So I just stood there with my face burning and my stomach in a knot, Dwight and Cotton hooted and hollered, slapping their knees and saying, "Squirrel pie!" Mrs. Odom put her arm around my shoulder, and when I got up my courage to look at her, she winked at me. "I'm so glad to have a feisty female around here to help me keep these boys under control. I've been needing a girl on my team." On her team? Mrs. Odom needed me on her team? I wish I could have saved that moment there in that weed-filled yard surrounded by those good-natured Odoms, with Wishbone sitting there on the cooler in front of us. Just pack it into one of Bertha's cannon jars to keep in that room. That when I was feeling bad about myself or loaded down with my troubles, I could open it up and breathe in the goodness of it and I'd feel better. But the moment passed, and Howard brought a piece of chicken out to the yard, and we tried to teach Wishbone to roll over, but all he wanted to do was eat the chicken. "Back in Raleigh, we got a fence around our yard, so he can run free back there," I said. Howard's smile faded, and he said, "Do you think your mama will let him keep him?" Shoot, I wished he hadn't said that, 'cause it stirred my worries up, and I'd been doing such a good job of keeping them locked tight. The truth of the matter was, there was no telling what Mama would think about me showing up back there with Wishbone. But I managed to push that worry away and say, "Sure she will. She's gonna love him." When are you leaving?" Howard asked in a tiny, quivery voice. I shrugged. "I don't know," I said. "Soon, I bet." But I knew in my heart that Mama still didn't have her feet on the ground. I mean, I hadn't even gotten so much as a postcard or a phone call from her since I'd been in Colby. I knew she was still laying around in her bathrobe in the dark, drinking diet soda for supper and not thinking about me one bit. Howard got quiet after that, so I finally tied Wishbone to the bike and headed back up to Gus and Bertha's. When I got there, Gus was sitting at the kitchen table while Bertha sliced green peppers from the garden and jabbered about that fancy new drugstore they were building out on Route 26. "Well, there they are," Gus said when he saw me and Wishbone, "a girl and her dog." Then he reached in his pocket and pulled out something that he held out to me in his palm, a little bone-shaped dog tag with Wishbone engraved on it. He turned it over and showed me it had a phone number on the other side. "Gus," Bertha squealed, "you are a prince." She kissed his cheek. "Ain't he a prince, Charlie?" I nodded. "Then I might be a king when you take a look at that," Gus said, nodding toward the coat rack by the back door. Hanging there with the raincoats and cardigans was a red dog leash. "I figured he needed a real leash instead of that old rope," Gus said. Bertha kissed him again. "Now you are a king," she said. "Ain't he, Charlie?" I just couldn't get over Gus going and doing such a nice thing for me. "Yes, ma'am," I agreed. "He is." Then Gus took Wishbone's collar off, attached the little tag to it, and put it back on. When I looked down at him with his collar on and his very own tag with his very own name, he seemed like he'd been mine forever, like he belonged right here with me, not astray anymore. And in the middle of that happy moment, I had a tiny seed of thought that I hurried to push out of my mind before it had time to grow. That thought was this: where in the world do I belong? Chapter 15. The next day before Sunday school, I raced to the fellowship hall where the Garden of Blessings was up on the bulletin board. I searched the paper flowers until I found mine. The other kids had made a bunch of flowers, 'cause I guess they had a bunch of blessings. But I had only made one for my blessing. I had written, "I am healthy," because Audrey had written that on one of hers. I took my flower down, and with a purple crayon I added, "I have a dog named Wishbone." When I got to Sunday school, I tried to tell kids about my new dog, but it seemed like nobody cared. They were busy calling out sins for Mrs. Mackey to write on a blackboard: cussing, bullying, lying, disobeying your parents. The sins were flying around that room like blackbirds in a cornfield. Charlie, Mrs. Mackey said, can you think of a sin? I bet leaving your children behind so you can start a new life is a sin. But of course, I wasn't about to add that one to the list, so I just said, no, ma'am. What about kicking and shoving? Audrey said. Then Howard started muttering under his breath next to me, pineapple, pineapple, pineapple. And maybe because we were in church, but a miracle happened. I was able to push my temper down and put a lid on it. I smiled and clamped my mouth shut tight so I wouldn't say anything to ruin this miracle moment. And then another miracle floated through that Sunday school window and settled on my shoulder and nudged me to say, I shouldn't have kicked and shoved you like I did, Audrey. I'm sorry. Well, let me tell you, that took the wind right out of her sails. Her eyebrows shot up and her mouth dropped open, and she said, that's okay. After Sunday school, on our way to the fellowship hall, Howard slapped me on the back and said, good job, Charlie. I told you that pineapple trick would work. I'd been counting the minutes until the last day of school. When it finally came, I skipped up to the bus stop in Jackie's majorette boots. I didn't care that they were hot and rubbed blisters on my heels. I strutted up the aisle of the bus and winked at those giggling girls like Jackie told me to do. Just wink at 'em, she'd said on the phone one night. That'll throw 'em for a loop so they won't know what to do. But some of those girls still giggled when I dropped into the seat next to Howard and handed him one of Bertha's banana muffins. Thanks, he said. Then he broke it in half and started picking out the raisins, placing them in a little pile on the seat between us. Wishbone dug up some beans last night. Uh-oh. Howard took a bite out of the muffin and made a face. Then he fished a raisin out of his mouth and added it to the pile on the seat. Gus get mad? He asked. Nah, he just said I couldn't let him in the garden any more. Bertha get mad? I shook my head. She told me a story about her cousin's dog who ate corn right off the stalks in her granddaddy's yard and got so sick he almost died. As the bus made its way down the mountain, I thought about my old school back in Raleigh. It felt like I'd been in Colby forever, and I hadn't heard from a single one of my so-called friends back home, except Carlene Morgan. She had sent me a postcard with a picture of the Capitol building where my class had gone on a field trip. You are lucky you didn't have to go, she had written. It was boring. LOL. Jackie told me she had seen my best friend, Elvina, at the movies with some girls from our Girl Scout troop. Did she ask about me? I said. No, but I told her you were doing good, Jackie said. Doing good? Ha! How would Jackie know? She was too busy living her perfect life with Carol Lee to think about me. She hardly ever even called anymore. One time when I was in third grade, I went with Scrappy to the cemetery to see where his daddy was buried. We found the moss covered headstone that read Albert Eugene Reese. At the top, it said gone but not forgotten. I wasn't even laying under the cold, hard ground like Albert, but I was gone and forgotten. Bertha kept telling me I should invite some of my old friends from Raleigh to visit me this summer. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, but that sounded like a bad idea to me. What would we do? Watch the squash grow out in the garden? Stare at Pegasus on the porch all night? Where would they sleep? Squished in my little bed with me on my Cinderella pillows? No, those Raleigh girls would not have fun here in Colby. When the last bell of the day rang, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Every day I had counted the minutes until I would get back home to Wishbone. Bertha told me he stood at the door and whined for me when I was gone. That's the truth, she said. Cross my heart and hope to die. On my way up the mountain, I stared out the window while Howard told me about Burl buying a motorcycle and his mama being mad as all get out. Then guess what? I saw three birds perched together up on the telephone line along the side of the road. Three birds on a wire was on my list of things to wish on. But it has to be exactly three birds according to Scrappy's friend Ray, And that's not as easy as it sounds, so I made my wish quick before one of the birds flew away. Chapter 16. Guess what? Bertha said when I got home. She reached into her pocket of her apron and pulled out an envelope. You got a letter from your daddy. I did. I stared at the envelope in her hand. That was Scrappy's handwriting, all right. Giant, wiggly printing like a first grader wrote. I put Wishbone's leash on and took him out front. I sat in Gus's lawn chair by the garden and stared down at the envelope. Miss Charlie Reese. If Mama had sent me a letter, which she never would, then she would have written Miss Charlemagne Reese to aggravate me. Then she would probably tell me goodbye because she was starting her new life without me. I studied the envelope some more. Wake County Correctional Center was printed in the corner. Well, now that didn't sound nearly as bad as county jail. I think folks in the county jail have to stay for a long time, but if Scrappy was just getting corrected, maybe that wouldn't take too long. I sniffed the envelope to see if I could smell his aftershave, but I couldn't. I took out the folded notebook paper and smoothed it on my lap. Dear Charlie, it's your old Scrappy Papa here saying hello and how are you? I am fine. This place is okay except for the lumpy gravy and lousy pillow. Jackie came to visit and brought me Hershey bars and a toothbrush. I bet you are having fun with Gus and Bertha. Tell them I will send some money when I can. Love, Scrappy. I turned the page over to see if there was more on the back. Nope, that was it. I looked at the word love. I traced the letters with my finger. Then I folded the paper up and put it back in the envelope. The next day, I was bored by lunchtime. I'd practiced sit and stay with Wishbone. I'd helped Bertha inspect the okra to figure out how many jars we'd need for pickling. I'd looked for four-leaf clovers over by the back porch, but I didn't find one. Then I shared my peanut butter sandwich with Wishbone, and that was it. Nothing else to do. So I figured I'd ride Lenny's bike down to Howard's. I hooked Wishbone's leash on the handlebars and off we went. When I got there, the Odom's house was buzzing like a beehive. Cotton was making something with sticks and rocks in the small square of shade next to the porch. Burl and Lenny were over in the driveway peering at the engine of Burl's motorcycle. Every now and then one of them would bang on something with a wrench. Dwight was tossing a basketball into the hoop on the streetlight pole at the edge of the yard, and Howard, I couldn't believe what he was doing. A crossword puzzle. Sitting on that ratty old couch on the porch doing a crossword puzzle. What kind of kid does that on the first day of summer? Hey, he said, adjusting his glasses. Wishbone jumped on the couch next to him and flopped over on his side, panting. Hey, I lifted the hair off the back of my neck and fanned myself. It sure is hot, I said. Want to study for Bible detective? Howard asked. Bible detective? I almost said, are you nuts? But for once I managed to keep my thoughts to myself, and I said, no, not really. I'll give you some of my Bible bucks, he said. I shook my head. That's okay. Then what do you want to do? I shrugged. I got a letter from Scrappy, I said. Howard sat up straight. You did? He put the crossword puzzle on the couch beside us. From jail? It's not jail, I said. It's a correctional facility. Same thing, Howard said. It is not. I'm pretty sure it is. It is not. I said it so loud Wishbone's head shot up and he looked at me like I was crazy. Pineapple, pineapple, pineapple. I did not want to get mad at Howard on the first day of summer. I must admit that even me and Howard hadn't known each other very long. He he could read me like a book. I could tell he knew I was wrestling with that temper of mine again, 'cause he changed the subject and just said, well, that's good you got a letter. He scratched Wishbone behind the ear. What'd he say? I wanted to tell Howard that Scrappy said how much he misses me and he can't wait to come home and watch Wheel of Fortune with me, that he was going to cook up a fancy supper for Mama with candles on the table and Willie Nelson on the radio, and maybe she'd wear that red dress he loved so much, and that when Jackie got a driver's license, he was going to let her drive all of us out to the country to buy corn and strawberries at a farm stand by the side of the road, Then we'd go home and have a barbecue out in the yard, and we might even hold hands and say the blessing like Howard's family did. But I didn't tell him any of that. I told him the truth. He said they have lumpy gravy and lousy pillows, I said. That's too bad. I almost told him that Scrappy signed his letter with the word love, but then that would probably sound dumb to a boy who gets loved so much every day of his life. Hey, maybe Mama will help us make cookies to send to him sometime. Really? Sure, Howard said. Want to go down to the creek? Okay. So me and Howard and Wishbone went behind the garage and followed the narrow trail that snaked through the cool, damp woods. I loved the earthy, mossy smell of the air and the soft tickle of the ferns that bowed down along the edges of the path. Wishbone trotted beside me, stopping every now and then to sniff at a tree or root around in a pile of rotten leaves. I wondered if he had been on this trail before. I bet he knew these woods better than anybody. Maybe he'd even slept under these very trees. I wanted to take his leash off and let him run free, but I was scared to. What if he decided he'd had enough of me and ran off to be a stray again? When we got to the creek, Wishbone nearly pulled me in when he jumped into the clear, gurgling water. Howard and I took off our shoes and stepped from rock to rock, while Wishbone leaped and pranced, sending up splashes of cold mountain water. This feels good, I said. I know. Howard teetered on the slippery rocks, and I was sure he was going to fall in any minute, but he didn't. Wishbone let out the funniest yips and bits at the water, trying to grab at the tiny minnows that darted around the rocks. Look at him! We both said at the exact same time. I jumped off the rock to the edge of the creek and motioned for Howard. Come quick, I hollered. Hook pinkies! What? Hook pinkies, I said. We both get to wish. We do? I nodded. If we two if two people say the same thing at the exact same time, they hook pinkies and make a wish, I said. Jackie taught me that. So Howard jumped to the edge of the creek and we hooked pinkies. I closed my eyes and made a wish. Did you make a wish? I asked. No. Why not? He stooped to swish his hand in the water, making the minnows scurry away. I don't really have anything to wish for, he said. I shook my head. How could anybody not have anything to wish for? I mean, even if you just wished you didn't have a wart on your thumb, or that you didn't have to eat oatmeal for breakfast, it seemed to me like you could think of something to wish for. Oh, good grief, Howard, there must be something. Well, actually, there is something I could wish for, he said. So we hooked pinkies again, and Howard closed his eyes. Did you make a wish? I asked. Yep. I bet I know what it is. I can't tell or it won't come true, remember? No, you can't tell, I said, but I can. It doesn't matter if I tell. I didn't know for sure if it was true, but I think it probably was. Just don't say whether I'm right or not, I said. Okay. You wished you didn't have that up-down walk, I said. When those words left my mouth, I could practically see them hurtling through the air toward Howard, quick and sharp like razors. Howard's face turned pale as a ghost, and his eyes flicked down at the ground. What had I done? Why had I said that? More than anything, I wanted to take those sharp words back, but I knew I couldn't. It suddenly felt like everything was frozen in time, just stopped cold, dead still. Like the creek water stopped flowing and the birds stopped chirping. Like the clouds above us stopped floating over the mountain tops. Even Wishbone stood still as a statue beside me. Then Howard broke through the frozen curtain of time by grabbing his shoes and heading off up the path toward his house, leaving me standing there ashamed and heavy hearted. I sat on the edge of the creek and held myself a pity party. That's what Jackie calls it when I feel sorry for myself. For heaven's sake, Charlie, she says, stop having such a pity party. But I couldn't help it. Why had I gone and said something so mean to the only kid in Colby who was nice to me? The kid who wanted to give me some of his Bible bucks and send cookies to Scrappy. The kid who let me share my troubles with him. I pictured my clothesline full of troubles and saw myself pinning on one another. I stayed there by the creek, wallowing in my pity, thinking about how this day had turned out so bad. By then, things suddenly went from bad to worse. A tiny striped chipmunk darted out of a rotten log beside the creek, and Wishbone bolted after it, yanking the leash right out of my hand. And before I could even get myself up off the ground, he had disappeared into the woods. Chapter 17. I searched those woods till it was almost dark. I called Wishbone's name till my throat hurt. I walked up and down the side of the road till my legs ached. Finally, I went to Howard's to get Lenny's bike that I left in the yard that afternoon. I could hear the Odoms inside eating supper, everybody laughing and saying, "Pass the butter," and stuff. I pictured them in there crowded around the kitchen table, the boys poking each other and grabbing for the last biscuit, Mrs. Odom cooking up more fried chicken and kissing the tops of their heads, Mr. Odom's eyes twinkling as he watched his happy family. I wondered if Howard had told them what I said about his wish, and if he did, what did all those good-hearted Odoms think of me now? When I got home, I went straight back to my room and held the biggest pity party of my life. I laid on Wishbone's pillow on the floor beside the bed, breathing in his doggy smell, and I cried until I fell asleep. I woke up to Bertha whispering my name. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the lamp in the living room floating through the half-open door of my room. I closed my eyes real quick and pretended like I was still asleep. I couldn't stand the thought of telling Bertha about my day, how Wishbone didn't want to be my dog anymore and had run off, how I said such a mean thing to Howard. I thought maybe Bertha would leave, but she didn't. She gave me a little shake and whispered my name again. "Come get some supper," she said. "I'm not hungry," I mumbled into my pillow. "Your favorite," she said, "grits with cheese and bacon." I shook my head. I felt like a pouty baby. I even had the urge to suck my thumb. When I acted like this back in Raleigh, Mama would say, "Quit that baby whining before I jerk a knot in you." But Bertha said, sometimes when you've had a bad day, eating grits makes you feel better." She poked me with an elbow. "I know that from experience," she added. I sat up and hugged my knees. I leaned a little closer to Bertha until we were touching, arm to arm, knee to knee. She smelled like someone who spent her days in the kitchen, bacon and coffee and cinnamon, but she looked like someone who spent her days outdoors, arms tan and leathery, dirt under her fingernails. "Wishbone is gone," I whispered. She nodded and pushed a strand of wispy hair behind her ear. "Gus is out looking for him," she said, "and Gus is a man you can count on." A teeny tiny glimmer of feel better worked its way into my heart. I knew she was right about that. Gus did seem like a man you could count on. "But what if Wishbone wants to be a stray again?" I asked. Bertha sat up straight and took my chin in her hand. "Charlie Reese," she said, "you think that dog don't know a good thing when he sees one?" "What good thing?" I said in my pouty baby voice. She held up a finger each time she counted off. "1, he eats bologna for breakfast. 2, he sleeps on a pillow. And 3, he is loved by an angel." "Angel? Ha! So here's where I had to go and ruin that image of me as an angel. I said something mean to Howard," I muttered. Silence. Why had I gone and told her that? I wished I could take those words back, gather them up like butterflies in a net, stay an angel in her eyes. And then I got this bad thought. What if Bertha was wrong about dogs loving you no matter what? What if Wishbone knows I'm mean and that's why he ran off? I could feel Bertha's warm skin against mine, hear her soft breathing in that stillness of that room. Finally, she slapped a hand on my knee and said, "You need some grits." As soon as I woke up the next day, I looked down at the pillow on the floor, and more than anything, I wanted Wishbone to be there. He wasn't. I hurried into the kitchen. Bertha was shelling peas at the table. "Where's Gus?" I asked. "He went to work." I sank into the chair across from her. "I guess he didn't find Wishbone," I said. She looked at me all sad-eyed and shook her head. "No, he didn't. But he said to tell you we can get out there and look when he gets home. He set up that trap of yours last night, and I put some scraps in it so we can keep an eye on that. And don't forget, Wishbone has a tag on his collar. I'm sure somebody will call us when they find him." She pushed a box of cereal toward me. "Eat some breakfast." But how could I eat with my stomach all balled up like this? And then there was the other problem, Howard. What was I going to do about Howard? Guilt was gnawing at my insides as I watched Bertha shelling those peas. Every now and then she glanced up at me, and when she did, I had to look away real quick. There she was over there on the other side of the table thinking I was an angel. And here I was on the other side feeling about as far from an angel as anybody could be. "Aren't you going to ask me what mean thing I said to Howard?" I asked her. She shook her head. "No, I'm not." "How come?" She tossed a handful of peas into the bowl and leaned toward me. "Charlie," she said, "you can't judge people for the mistakes they make. You judge them for how they fix those mistakes." She reached across the table and patted my hand. "Besides, you think I haven't ever said a word or two I wanted to snatch back?" She winked. "Just ask Gus if you don't believe me." It was for sure Bertha had said a lot of words in her life, seeing as how much she was a talker. But I was pretty sure none of those words were mean like mine. Mean and Bertha did not go together. "Now, why don't you go get dressed and we'll figure out what to do about Wishbone," she said. Before I could even think about how to start this sorry day, someone knocked on the front screen door, and imagine my surprise when I saw who it was. Howard. I stood there barefoot in my pajamas with my hair a big rat's nest and searched for something to say. But then Bertha jumped right in and said, "Well, looky who showed up here on our doorstep, Charlie." She held the door open. "Howard Odom in need of some cinnamon toast, I bet," she said, "or cereal, or eggs, or grits. You need some grits, Howard." He stepped inside and shook his head. "No, ma'am." Then he turned to me and said, "Want to pick wild strawberries?" He held up an empty milk carton with the top cut off. "I know where there's tons." Um, I pushed hair out of my eyes. Um, "Y'all go on and pick strawberries," Bertha said. "I'll keep an eye on things here." She nodded in the direction of the trap at the edge of the yard. And then I collapsed into a puddle of sorrow on the couch and told Howard about Wishbone running off. When I finished, all I wanted to do was flop down and cry. But Howard said, "What are you sitting here for? Let's go find him." Then the next thing I knew, he was out the door and grabbing his bike, leaving me to run to my room to get dressed and scramble after him.